Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be digging into the realities, the nuts and bolts of data integration. We talk a lot about what's necessary to really integrate, modern data resources in this world of AI. And to discuss that with me today, I've got returning guest Emily Jasper. Emily, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, as always. And I'm always excited to talk about this because I get very interested in solving the puzzle of how do customers or companies or even just anybody needing data figure out how to get it from point A to point B.
Well, and as we've sort of stumbled into AI, this is something where, one of the things we hear all the time is that organizations have got all this data and, they built data lakes and they, managed to accumulate great volumes of data. And yet, when it really came down to trying to get real results out of the applications that were building around it, they suddenly realized that it wasn't in the right place, that the quality wasn't what they needed, that they had all of these separate islands of data that weren't correlated well, and a whole bunch of different pieces. So you've been in the thick of actually making this happen in a whole range of different environments. What do you see as the things that organizations should be looking for in this, and how do they get out of this challenge?
Organizations are in a couple of different scenarios. One is, and if I pardon and use the idea around islands, let's think of then the cruise ship for those islands that has the massive buffet. And there is a glut of data and it's there. And trust me, as someone who loves data, it gets really exciting. You're like, oh, I'm going to get my hands on all of these things, except for sometimes it doesn't all go together. And sometimes it's a little too much and you walk out with an upset stomach and it's not what you are trying to achieve. And so those scenarios have popped up and dramatically impacted the way customers have felt the success of data programs have gone because it's been too much, too fast without a very clear initiative. And in those scenarios, you then run into the situation where the information integration or even governance of that kind of seems like a failure before you've even started. And that really ties into that glut of data. On the other side, you might have scenarios in which there's a lot of little bits of data in a lot of little places. Let's call it a snack bar if we're going to follow along.
I'm loving the analogy here. This is well, and it actually plays it really interestingly in Melanie Posey and I did a webinar talking about AI indigestion. About trying to integrate this, but anyway, so you got snack bars. It's
so then
smaller
you have a snack bar, which can be helpful, but it may not be satisfying. And so that is also where you're going to see maybe some of these initiatives that get taken on feel like they're not delivering enough. And so if you're an executive leader who is now tasked with this, you either have an initiative that is too much, unwieldy, and potentially really expensive, and it's not delivering the right value. Or on the other hand, you have something that's not moving the needle enough. And so when you're trying to justify the costs for both, you're kind of end up lost because at the end of the day, you needed a recipe. And so I think about that going back to what is the business trying to achieve? I think many of your listeners would fully agree some kind of centralized data warehouse or having connected data across several platforms in theory makes a ton of sense. I think that's where data architects come in, anyone managing information governance, all of us would agree on that. The how of it ends up being the challenge. And I think that ends up being where some of these really, we'll call them sexy initiatives come across. And, it started out with maybe cloud deployments. We then threw an LLM on top of that. And now you have the expansion into a broader AI strategy. But at the heart of it, are you actually solving certain challenges? And without knowing what those challenges were to begin with, you're just like throwing data and technology at an issue. And the integration of that then gets held up because you may not always have the right stakeholders involved. You may not have the right tools in place. And not everyone is then aligned on what the success of the program is. If we don't have any of that to begin with, then yeah, we're just gonna have indigestion or not having a satisfied outcome. And it's really challenging because this is your technology and your infrastructure. Like that can sometimes be why these programs don't succeed. And then you just end up in this like well of over and over again feeling like you're revisiting the same technology problem.
Well, and having shared perspectives on what the goal is, and this is the thing we keep going back to over and over again, and it's not new with AI, but it just seems to have gotten much worse, is understanding your use cases and making sure everybody's on board, but then also not getting locked into that very targeted implementation so that you've built a thing that does this one very specific thing really well and yet isn't extensible, isn't scalable. We saw a lot of this with automation efforts early on, right? Robotic process automation, great for doing a very specific thing, but yet if you then need to sort of bend it a bit, it's brittle enough that in most cases you may not be able to actually get it there. And that whole process piece you built, it works well as long as everybody stays within the guardrails. And guess what? Well, what do we know about IT projects? By the time they actually reach production, they're probably out of date with what the requirements are. So we got to start thinking in ways that are going to not only help us get deep enough, but also come at this with a path and an expectation that we're going to need to be flexible enough. Because the thing we keep saying over and over again, the thing about AI is the ecosystem is evolving so rapidly. We see it in our end user data. The IT practitioners are just overwhelmed with, they wake up the following morning and suddenly all the stuff that they knew was really different. And you start chucking agents into this and all manner of other odds and ends of things. It winds up being really important to have that broader team well aligned across that whole spectrum of the requirements and stakeholders that you need for this.
And you might even already have some of these solutions in house. And I think that's been the other pressure that AI has put on any type of information governance workflow has been, oh, suddenly this new vendor is available, or 7 vendors, or 100 vendors, and they're all knocking on your door telling you that they can solve your problem. And in many instances, depending on the size of your organization, you might already have contracts with some of the solution providers that are adding their own tools to this. And one of the, I think, challenges can be is that you're facing what might be a little bit of a slower rate to innovation with perhaps a more established technology. But is it slower because it's slow, or is it because they're being more careful or being more secure? They're taking governance processes into account, things like that. And from your perspective as a customer, is that something that is more important to you versus moving fast? And I think that ends up being a assessment into these types of programs and projects around who are the technology vendors you're going to work with. And if you are building a pro and con list as you look at them, you have to consider that the rate of innovation is changing, but think about the other elements of the project. Customer support. Do they have customer support? Are you going to be first in the queue, or are you going to be last in the queue? Like, those types of things. Do they only work during US East Coast hours, or are they global? Evaluating kind of the overall, vendor relationship is just as important as the actual requirement elements, as well as, of course, the price of those types of contracts. And I think, again, some of that gets lost in the mix because, someone might be less expensive, but they could not exist 6 months from now. So you have to really be cautious in evaluating that, while still being aware that someone who has a net new firm that's moving quickly, full of experts from perhaps an established technology company, they might have just as great a solution. So that should go into the calculus of anyone who's looking at these programs, and what the risk tolerance is of the firm you're working for when it comes to looking at the technology options that are available to you.
Well, you made two really important points there. One, that all of the pressure around getting AI results is meaning that natural tendency, on the technology side to chase the new shiny thing just gets amplified because we need it now. These folks seem to be really, have got this whiz bang thing, and this is great, and it looks like it's going to solve all our stuff, and we don't have time to think about the day two operational pieces that are going to come along with it. So, and at the same time, managing risk. The other thing, I'll put a link to some of the Voice of the Enterprise data. We're seeing AI project failure rates kick up.
Incredibly high right now. Incredibly high. In fact, I was just at ILTACon, which is a conference around law firm technologies. And if you can imagine, in the law firm space, not only do you have partners who will still have a literal Rolodex on their desk. So the idea of some kind of centralized data repository might be very far from their day-to-day priorities, even if that is something that is good for the firm's operations. But on the other hand, you have all of these many instances, librarians and researchers who've been brought into these AI projects, and their first reaction is, what are you actually trying to achieve? Because, and all of us have been there. We've been tapped for the special project, and nobody wants that special project to not go well, because that is tough for those of us who raised our hands. It's okay to fail, but the reality is that high failure rate is now creating a lot more skepticism in areas where AI agents could actually help deliver results. It's just not going to be, the silver bullet people thought.
It's not just click and, oh, guess what? We've got results. Well, and it's, I think, one of the big contributing factors is the easy accessibility of AI technology broadly. And, it's novel, it's new, and that extent to which, hey, you can just go out and pick your particular large language model out there, ask it some interesting questions, and wow, it seems to know a lot. So why can't we just turn it loose on everything that we, all of the bits that we have accumulated within the organization? What could possibly go wrong? And that end of that piece means that we've got to really start thinking about balancing the speed with which we're heading towards this and a little contemplation about what we're really trying to achieve, as you were pointing out.
Yeah, I think about this. So a lot of my day-to-day is focused on CRM use cases, customer relationship management, hardcore sales relationship management, marketing workflows that across many industries could also include portfolio management, deal prospecting, conflicts of interest checks, KYC, like a lot of different scenarios that kind of fall into that bucket. And at the end of the day, the people who are the primary users have specific jobs and goals that they're responsible for. So if you're thinking about introducing AI, let's say into a CRM workflow, you have to ask yourself, so what is the result you want the users to do? If it's sales, they have to sell more. So how is the agent going to help that? And I think that ends up being something that kind of gets forgotten every once in a while is like, what is the user actually measured on into their day to day? What's their compensation? We actually talk about this in sales compensation all the time, right? Is the incentive aligned with what the business goal actually is? So this is the same thing. Is the agent function aligned to what the measure of the goal, and in this case, a person's compensation, are they aligned? And if they're not aligned, you're not going to see that usage. You're not going to see those elements that could dramatically make a difference. And instead, you're just going to create more noise.
And complication and sprinkling in a little risk at the same time.
Just
Yeah.
a tiny bit of governance and security risk, just a tiny bit. Yeah, I think at the heart of it, I kept shouting last week. I was like, this is the age of library sciences. Like, they are the hot kids on the block right now. We need to find every single person with a library sciences degree and like bring them forward, because to me, this is like the time to shine. If you loved sentence parsing, right? That was, LLMs, that is for you. And library science is in the same way, because it gets into not only organization and taxonomy, but understanding kind of the structure of how everything gets organized, so that then you could improve search, you could improve connectivity. And that foundational element is why I'm seeing so many people coming from that background being brought into these AI initiatives, because it seems to finally be this. It's not just like add the shiny thing. It's like, oh, actually, like, let's get the engineer who actually knows how all this is supposed to work together. And then now we just have an interesting designer on top of it. And it's dramatically changing the way I think that some of these projects are being assessed, because they're being able to bring to the table information on what type of records are actually really valuable to the organization. It could be, if I go back to the law firm example, you know, time and billing. At the end of the day, you're only as good as your billings. And so if you're billing incorrectly because you don't have the correct account information in there, well, what are we going to do? And that ends up being the main pain point. And so then you're able to extract, well, how did we find out if it's the correct account? Well, the intake process was a little bit broken. However, we could repair it through the research process. Okay, well, then where are you getting the data there? And once you map a little bit of that out, and that's where some of these librarians have really come into play, then you say, oh, okay, if we actually improve this one element here, create a record, and then manage that centrally, these four other areas that depend on the record are now, we've reduced the risk of duplicates, we've reduced the risk of incorrect information, we've reduced the risk of incorrect billing.
I love the idea of librarian as vectorizing engine in terms of identifying this data. I mean, you've hit upon what is really that challenging. It's how do you actually interlink all of this? How do you do the relationships of how do you translate the relationships you need in the data into the results you're trying to get? And yeah, it seems so many situations in which the people are stumbling because they haven't, they may have all the piece parts you said, but they can't put them together in a way that they can actually get real results out of.
And so I think that putting together part ends up being the second biggest challenge, right? We have our first one, which is like, what are we even trying to do here? Which can leave a lot of room for debate and probably, takes up many Monday morning staff meetings in many organizations. But the second being that, how do we actually connect this, that point A to point B, as we opened with, ends up being something that I think the democratization of data is really important towards. And we know that there are going to be scenarios in which certain types of information shouldn't move between systems. But if you're able to identify what can move between systems as far as a unique identifier or a basic company profile information, something like that. Once you've identified that, and that's usually going to be helpful that your information security team can help you do that part. Then where else should that data item or data point live. And then, you evaluate then also obviously, what are the risks of data that shouldn't be associated to that in certain systems, thinking about personal data, anything related to ongoing privacy law changes. But on the other side of it, if it's, okay, well, this is the headquarter address and everybody can have the headquarter address because it's a publicly verifiable piece of information. And that helps us because that's important to our taxation process. Okay, that piece of information can come across a few systems. And when you start getting that picture, then you say, oh, the bridge between all of these might be a unique ID. Maybe we have another reference table somewhere else because we have to keep these two data sets from talking to each other. But once you have that there, you then get a collection of what starts building your golden record. And you have to know what those items are first, just because then you're not wasting time trying to build bridges and SQL queries and code and all of that between systems where you're exchanging data that doesn't actually help the other system.
Well, and to your point, potentially going across environments in which achieving that alignment and that correlation is really hard. And that aspect that, again, AI didn't fix this stuff. Yeah, for AI, we keep saying, data is the raw material from which it is built. It is not the fuel that drives it. And you can't just, this isn't like shoveling coal into the boiler. You actually you're building something, and you've got to build a solid enough foundation with the data that you have to actually get it there.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to start heading into data quality, but no, go ahead.
I was also going to head into data quality.
All right, then.
I love that. So data quality. I mean, everybody's like, what is quality? And I think about it, again, it's hard because in the CRM world, we kind of just already assume that data is garbage. And everyone in our space has heard, the adage, garbage in, garbage out. And so to me, it's one of the easiest places to start with that idea of how do we actually get initial quality. And you don't necessarily need to boil the ocean in that scenario where you're like, okay, I have 5 million records over 15 years. You probably don't need to start with that. Start with what's happened in the last 5 years and maybe even 3 years. Who are your active records? Like what are the pieces of information that the users are relying on absolutely every day? And what is the risk if some of that is wrong? They reach out to the wrong contact. They send a bill to the wrong place. They suddenly lose an account because an acquisition then made the contract defunct. Like those are the types of things that are the results of these types of changes not being reflected accurately. And if in addition to needing to justify why it's important to have good quality, I think a lot of us agree, you may have to justify like the cost of a program to assess that. And that's where that identifying like what happens when it's wrong versus what happens when it's right, and being able to quantify some of it gives you then the runway for financing some more governance support when it comes to these projects.
Well, and as you're pointing out, this isn't free. This takes work. You have to have people working on this stuff. But the idea also that you pointed out that you got to prioritize. This isn't something where you can think that, take your entire data estate and we're going to make it really great. Because that's going to take time. It's going to take effort, and scope and scale can sometimes be the death of a project just as much as the fundamental effort that's required. And that's something where, again, taking the approach that you're outlining, prioritize, figure out where you should be looking first. And those, where are those records that, again, it gets all back to managing risk, right? What happens is if it's right, what happens if it's wrong? And fundamentally, it's a risk calculation to be able to come at this, but and do it in a way that's not going to be totally overwhelming.
And that's where AI can help. Like, you and I, sure, we could spend a lot of time in a spreadsheet and like write some macros and and get like a picture of our database. But like that is where some of these agents, especially when you're sitting on data on the cloud, many have introduced these types of elements for a data hygiene perspective to tell you how many records are missing certain columns. What is your quote coverage of certain geographies, like, and if you're able to utilize AI for some of that assessment, it will help with the business prioritization. And that to me that's a perfect place to utilize that because, let's say you're a sales team and you specifically target markets in the Mid-Atlantic. That's where I live. So, anywhere from South Carolina up to Pennsylvania, let's call it. And you find in your record system that you really only have 10% penetration of your potential market. But the AI solution, because it can compare against third-party data that knows what type of other commercial opportunities might exist in that region, says, okay, you only have 10%, but you could easily add another 30 because of XYZ factors. Well, then you have a prospect list. And then you have an idea of how you're going to adjust your data to improve growing your market, in addition to getting quality within the system and then driving some true outcomes from your commercial team, which at the end of the day was what you were trying to achieve.
Right back to your original point, right? You got to understand where you're headed, and ensure that what you're actually putting in place is going to get you the results that actually gets you there.
Yeah, I've done a lot of like TAM analysis or things like that, and I realize as much as I love noodling on it on my own, I don't have enough time in the day in some cases. So as long as I have the inputs that I need, that gives me that perspective. And I think that is the element that when it comes to data governance, data integration, being able to use the agents to shortcut some of that processing. You still want to get an eye on it. And you don't want to necessarily unload sensitive data into any type of open model. But if you have closed models within, your four walls that are part of your secure process, utilize those for those types of assessments, because even those high level matrix will give you an idea of then kind of what the hill you're climbing is going to look like a little bit. But it also will give you maybe some insights around some of those gaps in the data quality process, which might be related to collection. So is it because you are collecting data? It's coming from a lead form? Is it based on a salesperson spending their lunch hour typing information in, right? Those types of pieces. You can also see information around like, what are the teams that are contributing to data? Which are teams that are under using data, and those types of insights are going to get you back into more of the business process evaluation that then will lead into the technology discussion. And that's a great place for AI to add value, just automatically right out of the gate.
Well, you brought it full circle. It's using AI appropriately, making sure you've got the data you need, but also being able to close that loop with an understanding about what you need to prioritize to actually achieve those goals.
Yeah. And I'll say, at the end of the day, don't be cautious on the pushing the models to be specific to your need, especially if they are within your four walls and they're relying on some of the information that's within your system, or they've been powered by third-party data providers. Not that you all listening are using this, but for example, Anthropic can leverage Capital IQ financial data in its Claude model. So if you have something like that and you're using some financial elements to assess market sizing, for example, you have an idea of what that definition around those financial metrics are. And when you get into that and you say, okay, this is specifically what I want, I think one element on the AI front is we're sometimes too quick to accept the first response back. Push, push, push. and really drive in and try to get those specifics. It might continue to give you back versions of the same. And that's when you know you're going to have to put your own kind of analyst hat on. But if you're able to push so that you're able to dig in, you might actually then extract an insight that could have taken weeks of staring at the spreadsheets from a human eye perspective that you may not have been able to get at.
Well, and again, it gets back to that old idea of iterate, for success. And we got to do the same kind of things with AI.
So if I was thinking about this from a nuts and bolts, going from point A to point B, my first recommendation is figure out your business goals. At the end of the day, you can read an API guide, you can read a Snowflake ingestion manual, but if you don't have your business goals aligned, it's not going to make as much sense. Then identify the data that's going to contribute to the most return on what those initiatives are. And then when you look at your systems, create those maps of what data points can add value across some of those systems so that when you get into, I'm going to ingest an API or I'm going to gather data from a Databricks Delta Share, you already have that in place. You're not overwhelmed with a glut of data that doesn't mean anything. And then you are able to very easily measure what type of return or impact that data integration had on the original workflow and processes that you identified. I think if folks work on that, you're going to see success of these programs rise, but you're also going to then start rebuilding those data foundations for whatever the next iteration of AI is going to be. Or we are just going to go back to automation. Who knows? But you've at least got a foundation.
Words to live by, and particularly when we start looking at this next phase of acceleration, which is greater adoption of agentic, which is, where are you pointing that agent? Why? What do you want that agent to do? What are you actually trying to achieve? Ingest, as you were saying, for the point of ingest, is only going to make your life more complicated.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've been trying to catch up on MCP as quickly as I can, which is not easy. But, I think about it and I understand, the idea like, oh, it's going to be like a USB for models. But at the end of the day, I actually think what it's going to really truly bring is contextual definition, that when the models are talking to each other, it's not just that the data can interact, it's that there is a lot more understanding based on assumption. I think about it, the difference between, you have gap accounting principles. Like you say that, everybody kind of knows what it means. And I think that's going to be where we go. We're not there yet. And it's going to take a lot of this contextual information that folks standardize to bring there. But that'll be also something that as institutions are looking at bringing in data and utilizing some of these tools, having that core definition of what they consider certain data elements, what is important to them in their business, will only make the addition of NCP related agents and other agentic flows more meaningful, less generic, and more impactful for the users.
Well, it's all about building trust in data sources and once again, reducing risk or managing risk.
Managing risk. Yeah. Sometimes we're just going to have to swallow it, and that's a component of it. But, that's also why then you have your risk protocols. So anyone running these projects, if you haven't talked to anyone in your risk department, get them on the phone so that they're all on the same page with you.
Emily, this has been great. I appreciate all of your insights. As I was saying, we spend a lot of time talking about the high-level technology pieces, but it's really the mechanics of the integration pieces that are really where you've got to be focusing in terms of making these projects successful.
I really appreciate you having me. And for those of you who don't know, I'm smiling ear to ear as we record this. So that just goes to show I love talking about this. So, and I hope, we can kind of keep digging in more as this rapidly changes.
Well, there's so much more to talk about as again, as we've been saying, this thing is moving fast. So I'll itch up for another episode as we start digging into some more detail. But for this one, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr, Baran Mediation, Kira Smith, and Adam Kowalski on the marketing and events teams. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be reviewing everything that happened at VMware Explore, Broadcom VMware Explore. Everything that's taken place there. I hope you'll join us then, because there's always something next in tech.